Welcome aboard.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior policy reporter Caitlin Owens.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all today. Thanks for coming out bright and early for our event on the future of brain health and cognitive care. Before we get started, a quick plug. If you don't already, please subscribe to my Future of Healthcare newsletter that I send every Friday. And without further ado, I'm excited to dive in on today's topic and welcome our first guest, Alliance for Aging Research CEO Sue Peshin. All right, Sue, let's dive right in.
Great.
A major focus of yours has been access to new Alzheimer's treatments, and you've been critical of Medicare's coverage policy. Can you tell us what's the link between that policy and access?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. So since April of 2022, so a little over 2 years now, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which runs the Medicare program, has uniquely locked down Medicare beneficiary access to FDA-approved early Alzheimer's therapies. And they've done this by applying an overly restrictive utilization management tool that they created. It wasn't created by Congress, it was something that the agency created, and it's called Coverage with Evidence Development, or CED for short. And under a CED, Medicare indiscriminately mandates that beneficiaries have to enroll in a clinical study for coverage of the selected treatments, or else coverage will be denied. And the program also imposes eligibility criteria on the health professionals and hospitals that qualify to collect the data that run the studies. And so what that means in effect is that only a small fraction of Medicare beneficiaries have gotten access to the two currently available early Alzheimer's treatments, which are Leqembi and Kisunla. So, we're really concerned about that. And this was actually the first time Medicare ever did this for on-label use of an FDA-approved drug. They had never done this for drugs before. They previously applied this to medical devices and other types of procedures like stem cell therapy, cochlear implants, less invasive, heart valve treatments. All those affect millions of Medicare beneficiaries. And what we're doing is we're really creating more of an equity issue between people who can pay out of pocket and the very few people who depend on the program for coverage, and only a small portion of those folks can get access to these therapies.
And so have you seen an effect on uptake of the drugs since they were approved?
Well, we would like to see more. We have asked the Medicare program a number of times. They have not given presentations on this in venues where they're invited to come quarterly at HHS. It's estimated that around 10 to 12,000 patients are on medications now, but you have over 1 million that have either MCI related, which is mild cognitive impairment related to Alzheimer's disease, or early Alzheimer's. So that's a lot of people. And every day, it's estimated about 2,000 patients transition from that early period where they might benefit from the therapy to a more moderate or severe stage of the illness. And so they're missing out. Time is really important.
And so obviously we're talking about Medicare because of the Medicare coverage policy, and a lot of people who qualify for the drugs are on Medicare. But can you talk about the impact on private plan coverage of these drugs?
Absolutely. I mean, Medicare is the big elephant. So a lot of private insurance companies, the private market follows what CMS decides, what the Medicare program decides. And so right now, there are still plans like Cigna, for example, and TRICARE, which serves active duty military, that call these therapies experimental, and they're not covering them at all. And then there are some other private plans that just have very complex other types of layers of utilization management. So it just makes it real tough. So especially for, underserved communities, communities of color, rural, communities where they may not have as much access or help with navigating the system, they're going to be the hardest hit.
And it's something I have covered over the past few years is there's a scientific debate, within the scientific community about how well these drugs actually work and how meaningful they are to patients. Where do you fall in that debate?
Well, first of all, I'm not a scientist. One of the issues I think that we have a problem with is neither is CMS. They're a payer. They're not a biomedical agency, and they're second guessing the FDA, who actually have judged these drugs and approved these drugs to be safe and effective for people. They're not curative. The community knows they're not curative. They're first-line disease-modifying therapies, which what that means is they're the first ones that have been approved that show they can create an effect on the illness by delaying the progression of the illness. And that's remarkable when you think about if you have a loved one that has cancer, oftentimes they may have 4 or 5 different types of treatment options. If they fail one, then there's another one, then there's another one after that. We pay, and Medicare pays, for those types of therapies. Yet here's the first chance at disease-modifying therapies, and there's this huge barrier that's been set up. And it affects everything around it too, diagnostics and detection, all of that. And it's really unfortunate, and it's all basically based on trying to reduce costs in the Medicare program. And we shouldn't cherry pick diseases like that. Nobody. We're sitting here now in our jobs, right? We're paying into the Medicare program, into our paychecks. We all do that. You don't expect that when you need something, when you get diagnosed with something, that all of a sudden it's gonna be like, oh, sorry, not available. You got a condition that, we don't cover the treatment for.
And so let's back up a little bit in this process and talk about diagnostics. Where obviously to get treated with Alzheimer's, you have to know you have it. Can you talk about Medicare's coverage policies of those various diagnostics?
Sure, and there is some good news there. For about the last 11, 12 years or so, Medicare did have a restrictive coverage policy around amyloid PET scans, which are a specialized type of PET scan that allow you to see amyloid buildup in the brain, which is what these drugs respond to. And finally, after I think the advocacy community really pushed hard, and there was a lot of kind of public pressure, Medicare lifted the coverage with evidence development restriction on them. But it takes a while, so it's been about a year or so, and it takes a while for the health systems to kind of catch up. People are now starting to get access. There are issues with new blood tests, which are very exciting, and a lot of people are interested in getting. And then also around screening. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force is another federal agency that has screening guidelines like we have for mammogram and prostate cancer and all that. And the one for screening for detection of cognitive impairment has been stuck, in an uncovered kind of lane for a long time. And most of the rationale behind why is because there were no treatments. They said there are no disease-modifying treatments available. Well, now we've had these treatments for a couple of years, and it's time to lift and allow Medicare to cover it, allow Medicare to include it. We pushed a number of years ago as part of the Affordable Care Act to insert it into the Medicare wellness visit. So there is something in there. But in terms of the uptake of it, it's much different than the screenings that are considered an A or a B recommendation by this entity. So we really hope that in the next year they reconsider it and change it, because it's still estimated that about 50% of cases are missed in primary care. And so that is also a huge barrier. But when you have these coverage things and this sort of messaging around, restriction of treatment and all that, you want to encourage the medical community to identify it. They want to feel like there's something they can do for their patients, and there is.
And so you mentioned blood tests. Why would that be an advancement over the current screening tools?
Well, I mean, PET scans, are not, they're pretty widely available, but they are definitely pricier. It's a complicated, sort of scan. It's a procedure. You have to get just like, other types of diagnostic scans, and a blood test at a level where you can go to a local, center or in your doctor's office would just be a lot less hassle, easier, cheaper. And so CMS is actually looking at reimbursement around that right now, and we're advocating around that as well, because we want to make sure that there's enough reimbursement, that there's an incentive to make sure that these blood tests are widely available.
So when the FDA first gave one of these anti-amyloid drugs approval, there was kind of this big uproar of some criticism from some corners of that approval, accelerated approval, being not based in science. You have an interesting and different take on which agency is undermining science. Can you share?
Sure. I mean, part of what it's interesting to us, seeing all this dialogue about misinformation and disinformation, and certainly COVID-19, was not helpful around all of that related to vaccines. But I think over the years that CMS has been doing coverage with evidence development now for well over 20 years. And their kind of second questioning of the FDA, again, as a payer, not as FDA is a biomedical agency. That's what they're charged with. They have experts there that know how to evaluate medications. CMS is looking at it from a payer lens, and they're trying to cut costs, but they raise it as though it's a research question. So that creates, doubt, and it creates misinformation. And that is, concerns us quite a bit. Accelerated approval by the FDA is approval. It was created during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, to try to get therapies to market for diseases that had no treatments at the time and that were deadly. And it's helped millions of people. It's primarily been used in cancer, actually, and in rare diseases. And it was used in Alzheimer's. And CMS, I think, took the opportunity of, scientific debate happens all the time in every disease area, as it should. But they kind of leveraged that to make this an issue. And in fact, they actually tried to apply coverage with evidence development to CAR T therapies a couple years before they did it with the Alzheimer's drugs. And the cancer community pushed back really hard. And they changed it. They pulled back on it. And CAR T therapy is upwards of the $500,000 range. So it's a lot more expensive. It's usually a fourth or fifth line therapy in cancer. I'm not saying, Medicare should cover it, but they should also cover Alzheimer's. And we need to stop this, cherry picking.
So Sue, we're almost out of time. I want to end with the news. President-elect Trump has announced the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as HHS Secretary, and Dr. Oz as CMS Administrator, agencies you clearly work a lot with. What are your thoughts on those nominations?
Okay, so yeah, way to put me on the spot. The Alliance for Aging Research has already, we put out a statement last Thursday that we oppose RFK Jr.'s nomination, and it's not just coming out for the first time. We've been speaking out, and we work a lot on vaccines, so we've spoken a lot about anti-vax. I was really surprised by the nomination because we were strongly supportive of Operation Warp Speed, which was from the first Trump administration, and really an incredible coordination between government and industry to get vaccines out in a miraculous amount of time from the way that it usually takes. Within the first 10 months, saved about 200,000 people's lives. that would have otherwise died. And RFK Jr. was known as one of the disinformation dozen, dangerous dozen or something. So he was one of the, profiteers, and he made millions of dollars off of spreading misinformation. So he was actively fighting against this effort that was in the first administration that saved millions of lives. That concerns us a lot. He runs an organization with 8 people. HHS has 88,000 employees. He does not have that management experience. That concerns us as well. And as far as CMS, we want to make sure that a patient's health is prioritized over economic risk. And that's our main priority. And if whoever gets put there is interested in that, we're all in. But that's remains to be seen, and we'll see how this unfolds. We just want to make sure that we are still respecting science, we are respecting FDA. They are such an important agency. There's been a lot of dismantling of their credibility, and you can't sort of twist the issue of misinformation and sort of hide behind it as a banner while you're pushing it at the same time.
Right.
We're just not going to let that happen.
Well, Sue, we are out of time now. Thank you so much for joining us today and for such a great conversation.
Thank you.
And now, a message from our sponsor.
My name is Ann White, president of Lilly Neuroscience. Over the years, I've spent time with many of you in DC speaking about the promise of new Alzheimer's innovation. And now, after decades of research, new diagnostic tools and disease-modifying treatments are available. We have the opportunity to rewrite the story of Alzheimer's disease. However, these advances in science are outpacing our health system's readiness to deliver care. Patients currently face multiple obstacles across detection, diagnosis, and treatment. By working together, we can remove barriers, improve patient experience, and better position the scientific community for additional innovation. Solving for our most urgent access challenges today will help us realize full potential of Alzheimer's science for years to come. New hope for better aging is within our reach, and the time to act is now. So thank you for your partnership and your commitment to these important efforts.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator and Axios publisher, Nicholas Johnston.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicholas Johnston. I'm the publisher of Axios. Thank you so much for being here today. I love our events. They're the physical manifestation of our journalists. You get to see that our journalists are actually real people, not robots. We get to see that you are real people and not robots on the internet. So thank you so much for coming out this morning. We're also hugely grateful to our partners. Everything we do at Axios is only possible because of the support of our partners. So huge, huge thanks to Lilly for making today's conversation possible. And so I'm very excited to welcome to our View from the Top conversation Lilly's Senior Vice President for Neuroscience, Laura Steele. Laura, welcome to the Axios stage. Good morning. So Alzheimer's treatment is such a fascinating topic in the newsroom because it feels like there's so much movement on the treatment options and innovation. So from your standpoint, what do these new treatment options mean?
It is an exciting time in Alzheimer's. So with the recent approvals of the amyloid targeting treatments, these really provide an opportunity to help appropriate patients with early symptomatic Alzheimer's. And it gives them potential to have more time because essentially what these agents can do is, slow the progression into later stages. Lilly's obviously invested over $10 billion over 35 years into research and development from an Alzheimer's standpoint. As we launch some of these new innovations across the industry, research is alive and well. It allows us to learn from patient experience and then continue to invest in different ways as we continue to find a cure for Alzheimer's. So we're really excited. I think you see now that clinical research is really focused more on those earlier stages of Alzheimer's with the hope of treating early.
So the treatments are the first step. Now it's delivering to those patients. And so can you share a little bit about how we can encourage people to work with specialists, seek out these kinds of things. Like, how do you view the work that needs to be done to make sure people get the timely and accurate diagnosis so they can benefit from these innovations?
Absolutely. So there's a lot that we need to do.
Right.
And so the first thing we need to do is we need to just start talking about it. We need to start talking to each other, and we need to start talking to our healthcare professionals. And we need to act quickly. We need to recognize that early detection is important, and also accurate diagnosis. We need to get over the stigma too that currently exists. I think there's a societal notion that all patients with Alzheimer's are the same. And really what you see based on the different stages that exist across Alzheimer's is your earlier stage patients, so those with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, they don't present the same as a late stage patient. They still have their independence. And so that's an important differentiation that we need to start to recognize. When patients start to experience symptoms, they need to go into their healthcare professional's office and start that conversation. But at the same time, we need our healthcare professionals to not dismiss and say, hey, it's just a sign of normal aging, and go on with the day, right? We need to recognize that, hey, treating early really matters for these patients, and we need to focus on their early detection.
This is a through line, I think, in a lot of our coverage about how, like, that sense of vigilance, where if you wait, you're not able to benefit from a lot of these innovations. And so these kinds of conversations and making sure people are comfortable, like, wait a minute, is this something I need to talk to my doctor
Absolutely.
about?
And we know patients swirl. It takes years to get a diagnosis, even though they knew for a couple years, right? And they were seeking care. And then lastly, look, we need from a Medicare and a commercial standpoint, we need to offer broad access. I think we're lagging behind from an access and availability standpoint. It's not matching the innovation that's coming to the marketplace.
This was a big topic that Sue and Caitlin talked about.
Absolutely.
Could you expand a little bit more about how, like, Medicare can help? And what's, I think, interesting about doing these events in Washington, like, these are the folks who help write these policies, who talk to their bosses to set these priorities. What role can Medicare play in, I think, in CMS pushing that along?
Yes, I mean, I think Susan touched on this a lot, but there's the national coverage determination with the coverage for evidence development requirement that any patient who's going to be started on a treatment has to go through. We've had 2 phase 3 clinical trials, 2 FDA approvals, multiple peer review manuscripts that have answered these questions. And so this is just another step. It's an administrative burden, it's an access burden to your rural communities, and it's an access burden for the future. And then it just makes commercialization really hard to get your medicine to patients when this is another step in a really complex ecosystem as patients are trying to get care.
Right, and it sounds like the federal government has to be an active partner in this. Once you even check these first boxes about having that kind of vigilance and intervention, there needs to be an insurance component of that, of the government stepping in doing that. What's next? Like, spin this forward. Like, there's been so much change just in the past couple of years in these kinds of treatments, right? You're at a company doing, like, spending, as you said, tens of millions of dollars on this. Like, what's over the horizon? What gets you excited?
So a lot gets me excited. I think first, the focus on early detection and accurate diagnosis, but as you look across clinical research pipelines, I think you'll see that the investment dollars are really focused on this concept of identifying the patient early and treating early to slow the progression or to potentially prevent a patient from ever getting there. And so I think that is truly exciting, especially for people who are experiencing that with family members today. I think the next thing that really excites me is the emergence of the blood-based biomarkers that are currently in the marketplace and will continue to develop. Those really provide the opportunity to increase access, availability, affordability for patients at a massive scale. And so if you think about if you can treat patients at a more massive scale, you can then better get appropriate patients into the treatment funnel at the right time. And so those 2 areas are very exciting.
So it's very much that opportunity to, like, find this earlier.
Yes.
So you can attack it earlier and then develop more research around a broader base of patients to try and make more. Super fascinating, like, a very big moment, I think, in this. Now, we're almost out of time. We'd like to end on one fun thing here at Axios. You've recently returned to the U.S. from a stint in the United Kingdom. What do you miss most about your old place?
I miss a lot. So we loved it. So I think, obviously, I miss the people. because we met tremendous people and they became our lifelong friends. I think you go over to do an assignment in the United Kingdom, or at least I did, and you assume this should be an easy transition because we speak the same language. I quickly realized it's a very different language, but we have 2 children. And so we learned many phrases. So my young son, he would be 6 years old and finish his homework and say done and dusted, right? So there were like all these things. But my favorite one is we were at a sports match for my daughter. And, you know, we have an American mentality, I think, to sports, and which was toned down while we were over there. But somebody takes a shot and misses the basket in netball, and all the parents scream, unlucky! And my husband and I said, oh, did you say unlucky? So then when we got home, we had to tell my daughter, like, look, it's not really unlucky. Like, you got to practice to make the shot. So don't tell anybody we said that. And so look, I think that's the approach here too, is we need to plan. We need to develop innovation.
Right.
We don't want to scream at the end, unlucky, because the system was not prepared.
That is a perfect way to bring this all together with the
There
bow.
we go.
I hope your kids do well in school with all
Me
their
too.
interesting British idioms. Laura, thanks so much for being here
you for
today.
having
Huge
me.
thanks to Lily for making this conversation possible. Stick around. My colleague Peter will be up on the stage next.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Axios Pro healthcare policy reporter Peter Sullivan.
Hi all, thanks again for coming. Before our next guest, just a real quick plug for my newsletter, Axios Pro Healthcare Policy. I write it with Victoria Knight. We're up on the Hill getting you all the latest news and scoops on healthcare from up there. So without further ado, we're super excited to have a real leader in this space, Maine Senator Susan Collins. Thanks so much for being here with us. So I know obviously you've done a whole lot of work in the Alzheimer's space, and I figured I'd start just last month. I think you had 2 bills signed into law, including making sure the NIH has a specific budget specifically on Alzheimer's. So maybe talk about those 2 bills and how that's affecting kind of the current landscape here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for asking me to join you this morning. Back in 2011, I teamed up with former Senator Evan Bayh, and we passed legislation called the NAPA Act. I know everybody thinks of wine, but in this case, it applied to Alzheimer's. And what it did was create an expert council who could come up with a national strategy and a coordinated approach, which we did not have at that time. It was accompanied by another proposal, and both of the extensions of these became law on October 1st, which allowed the NIH to bypass OMB and submit its budget for dementia-related diseases directly to Congress. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but believe me, it is. Because if an agency has to go through OMB, as the vast majority of them do, and its budget is cut, the chances are that we who serve in Congress are never going to know about that. The agency officials will dance around the issue if you ask them, because they have to follow a process. So this allows what we call a bypass budget. And here's the difference that it's made. Back in 2011, we were only spending $500 million on Alzheimer's and other dementias. Now we are spending $3.8 billion. And if the appropriations bill passes, we will cross the $4 billion threshold. So that's the difference that it makes. Once you know from the scientists, the experts, the caregivers, the families, looking at the whole picture, you have a much better idea of what kind of funding is needed.
Yeah, and obviously you have an important role on the Appropriations Committee, specifically on that funding aspect going forward. Is this just a question of NIH funding, or are there other agencies, FDA funding, that you need to target or increase to get at this?
Well, another piece of legislation that I have pending it takes a public health approach to Alzheimer's to try to encourage earlier diagnosis, access to information, support for caregivers. It's called the BOLD Act. It passed a few years ago. It's still pending. It was reported from the Senate Health Committee with overwhelming bipartisan support. But it targets funding that goes to states, but it's through primarily the CDC. Okay. And as you point out, the FDA plays a huge role in approving drugs. And for the first time, we actually have medications on the market that, if they are administered very early on, and that's key, can help slow cognitive decline. And that, to me, is very exciting, because for years, we were doing studies on amyloid plaque, how to clear it from the brain, but the medications were not being shown to be efficacious. And that has finally changed, and now it's getting coverage has been a battle. But that is very exciting. And we're also expanding the research. I think ultimately we're going to find that Alzheimer's and probably Lewy bodies and frontal lobe dementia and other kinds of dementia are multifactorial, and that it's going to involve everything from inflammation, the tau protein tangles that we see, amyloid plaque, lifestyle, a whole range of factors.
Yeah, so it's great you brought up the new treatments and medications that are available. Just to drill down on that a little, as you mentioned, there was sort of a debate, at least at the beginning, around Medicare coverage. How do you kind of view do you think Congress needs to do anything to clarify Medicare coverage around treatments like this, or how do you view the landscape from a policy perspective now?
It's been frustrating to me that often CMS has taken such a short-sighted view. CMS's job is not to decide which drugs are appropriate for which diseases. And I felt that CMS got way outside its lane when it started restricting under the Medicare program access to these promising new drugs that had been approved by the FDA. It's not CMS's job to decide drug approval. And I went back and forth with the administrator of CMS on this issue. Eventually, they agreed that if the patient and the physician enrolled in a registry where they can monitor the effectiveness, that they would cover it. But it took a real battle. And I can't help but think how many people lost access to the drug because it does have to be administered at early stages while this battle was going on. We're still having trouble with the TRICARE program also. Ironically, the VA, in contrast to DOD's TRICARE program, has been good about accepting these new therapies and covering them for our veterans.
Yeah, I mean, just more broadly on this, I mean, you've been working on these issues in Congress a long time. Do you feel like awareness among your colleagues, other members of Congress, has increased? Do you feel like a lot of Congress is aware of, how big a problem Alzheimer's is, the need to do something about it, or is there still kind of education in Congress that needs to be done?
I'm so glad that you asked that question, because when I was growing up, we called people senile. Mm-hmm. We did not realize that this was not a normal part of the aging process, that these dementias were illnesses. And so even when I got to Congress in 1997, there was still a prevalent view that this was a normal part of the aging process. And as someone who lost my father, my grandfather, and 2 uncles to this devastating disease, I was very motivated both personally and professionally to help solve this mystery. And I visited labs in Maine, our famous Jackson laboratories, at Harvard, at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Mayo Clinic, to educate myself and to talk to the scientists on the front lines. And we have worked very hard through hearings to change the perception and educate people. Now I think people understand that we're talking about illnesses. We are not talking about a normal part of the aging process. What's more, I think there's a greater understanding of not only how devastating this disease is for its victims and family members and caregivers, but also the economic consequences are huge. Yeah. The Medicare-Medicaid program, if memory serves me correctly, I believe last year it was $360 billion spent on treating people, on taking care of people with Alzheimer's, not treating them, but taking care of them.
Right.
And in Maine, 10%, we're the oldest state in the nation by median age, 10% of those over age 65 are suffering from Alzheimer's.
Yeah, and now just to zoom out a little bit, I mean, obviously we've talked a bit about appropriations, but obviously this is all affected. I think people in the room are interested in just the funding picture in general. How do you feel like there has to be another CR at the end of the month? Are you going to be able to get the health spending bill done in December? Or what's the update on that?
I have to say that this has been extremely frustrating because Chair Patty Murray and I have worked as a team to get all of the appropriations bills out of committee last year. We got all but one out this year. Most of them, all of them had overwhelming bipartisan support, and many of them were unanimous, which hadn't happened in years. We had 50 hearings and briefings, so we did extensive review of President Biden's budget. Unfortunately, with the exception of a 3-bill package last year, the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, has not brought any of those bills to the Senate floor, which is a source of huge frustration to me. So a short-term continuing resolution was passed, which expires December 20th. I think that we should get that work done this year. For one thing, and I said this regardless of who became president, they deserve a clean slate so that they can focus on the FY26 budget. But second, if we do a continuing resolution, what the implications are for agencies is they can't enter into new contracts. It overfunds programs that should be cut back. It underfunds programs like biomedical research that should be increased. And as I said, if it passes at the level that we approved in committee, we will have an increase in Alzheimer's research funding that will take us to over $4 billion for the first time. But if we can't get that bill through because we're on an automatic pilot, then that funding increase won't go through. So the consequences are huge. And as someone who believes so strongly that our investment in biomedical research pays dividends, I'm working hard to try to get this work done now. Look, we could have been working on appropriations bills all week, and we haven't. So that is a source of great frustration to me. As far as predicting, I'm having a meeting with Chairman Cole from the House later today. He's been a great ally on Alzheimer's disease and on getting our work done. I think if we're left up to the four heads of the Appropriations Committee, we would get it done.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, we're nearing the end, but we do have a new administration coming in. They've announced some of their health picks already, RFK for HHS, Dr. Oz for CMS. Are you worried that there could be upheaval in sort of what we've been talking about around NIH and FDA and the health agencies next year?
I think there could be. What we're going to do, and what I have argued strenuously against the proposal of having recess appointments, which would avoid and evade the Senate's constitutional duty to do advice and consent. And to me, that means a background check. It means extensive committee investigations and questionnaires and public hearings at which we can ask these individuals questions. When it comes to HHS and the Secretary of HHS, although the Finance Committee has primary jurisdiction and will actually vote on the nominee, the Help Committee on which I serve will have a hearing as well, and I'm looking forward to asking those questions. I think they're really important.
Absolutely. Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. After that great conversation, we're excited. We've got another one for you. Going to move right along to another person very active on these issues, California Congresswoman Nanette Barragán. Hi, thanks so much for joining us. So maybe I'd start with you have a personal connection to these issues, having experienced caregiving for your mom. So maybe talk about that and how that kind of has affected maybe informed your policy work on this.
Yeah, so my mom's 83 and she's got Alzheimer's, and I'm one of her caregivers, her primary caregivers. And I've just seen through caregiving for her the challenges, barriers that patients face. And there's really nothing like a personal home experience to see up front where the problems are. And then I see them and I say, how can we help? How can I do something in Congress so that other families also have the ability to better address cares and needs for Alzheimer's patients? I think the big one for me right now is caregiving. Mm-hmm. There's a few components to that. Number one is getting the access. Who's going to pay for it? Mm-hmm. It's very expensive when a loved one needs 24/7 care, and you may find somebody originally to come, but then as the disease progresses, you'll see higher turnover, pay is too low. My mother had to wait on a wait list to get in-home care through the federal waiver program. And I just checked, and you still have thousands of people on the wait list, even in the state of California. So it's run by California, but it's federally funded. And a lot of people don't even know about it. They don't even know that once you get care through maybe a county program, you can apply for this federal program, but there is a wait list. So things like that, it's access to care. You know, if you have a loved one and you go to the doctor, the first thing you say is, what is available? Is there something that could slow the progression? Is there something that could help? And so, you know, I think that's a conversation we all have when it comes to the care of our loved ones. So I think there's a lot that I always encounter, and then I'll say, can we do something about this? And I think that's where I try to use my energies in the Congress. Yeah.
We also talked a bit about the treatment front. You had a bipartisan bill around Medicare coverage of some of these treatments. You know, that situation has changed a little since the early days. I mean, how do you still think legislation is needed around Medicare coverage of these treatments, or how are you kind of viewing that?
Well, I first of all think any treatment should be available to everybody, regardless of your income. So if the FDA is going to approve something, it should be available if you're on Medicare, and not just those who can afford it. And so that's where I think for me the equity lens comes into play. My mother is on, Medi-Cal, Medicaid, so she's low income, and so if there's a drug that's approved, if she can't get access to it, I see that as not just for her, and her Alzheimer's is moved to a more advanced stage that she doesn't really qualify for these treatments. But I think if my mother were in an earlier stage, she wouldn't even be able to get access to it. That would not be an option. And so I do think that there needs to be continuing efforts to make sure that CMS is providing that coverage for everybody on a equal basis. And so we continue to push my Access to Innovative Treatments Act, where number one, you shouldn't be making these decisions on an entire class of drugs, especially if there's new drugs coming after a decision has been made, and if there's reconsideration, that it's done more timely, that it doesn't take years, that it takes months for them to look at the data.
Yeah, and obviously you also work with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I wonder does that work connect with this from a health equity perspective? How do you think about that?
It's very much tied together, and my work with the CHC, my mom is Latino. I represent a huge Latino population, so it's all the same. It's really the same constituency. When you look at the rates of Alzheimer's and dementia, we're seeing the numbers say that it's going to be, Latino populations are going to be highly impacted, infected, and have some of the highest numbers. So I think it's also important too that you have people from our communities be part of these clinical trials, which I know has been a continuing effort, continuing challenge, is to get people to trust the system, to want to be part of the trials, but making sure they're also a part of the trials is something that we've done and advocated for in the Hispanic Caucus, along with parity on access to care. So I think that's one of the areas. One of the other areas of, I think, legislation that I have is providing more training to primary care physicians. I can tell you about my mom's own personal experience. I remember it was years ago, where I thought I saw early signs, and I went with her to a doctor, and I said, hey, these are the things I'm seeing in my mother. Can we have her checked out? And they sent her to an appointment. And the question is, do you know how you got dressed this morning? Do you know what year it is? And the questions were so clearly for people that were more advanced than early detection that I said to myself, is this really the kind of questions? Is this really the type of test there should be for somebody to get early detection? And I remember when we went for the follow-up appointment, they said, well, your mother's fine. It turned into a conversation about her diet. And more Mediterranean diet is what I remember the conversation being. And so nowadays, we hear about these advances in testing and biomarkers, but again, the coverage isn't there. CMS isn't even covering, what the panel is recommending to cover the cost. It just kind of makes you wonder, wait, why is this not working? Is this something that's going to help people in the future? Why would we not invest? And I think the problem with the U.S. healthcare system that I continue to have an issue with is we're more reactive than preventive. And I think that's going to cost more dollars. And if we can prevent and extend quality of life for people who have Alzheimer's or who are, in the early stages, that we should be doing all those efforts and making it available for the patient, and their doctor to make those decisions. Yeah.
And so, as we mentioned, you've been able to work with some Republicans on these issues. Have you found that, on either side of the aisle, a lot of members are interested in this, or is there a lot of education you have to do around, sort of just how big an issue Alzheimer's is, why it needs to be dealt with, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I look at healthcare through a lens of not whether it's a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. This is a healthcare issue. It impacts everybody, regardless of your political status. So who can I work with on this? Now, I have found that when there is a Democrat in the White House and administration that's executing, it's easier for Republicans, to sometimes go after them. And then it becomes a little bit more of a, well, what are you doing? You're joining the other side. And for me, I don't look at it that way. I look at it, well, is this the right thing or is this the wrong thing? Is this an access to care, to treatment issue? Because if that's the case, I'm going to team up with whoever I need to get this done. So I do hope that in this incoming administration, that we are going to continue the work, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who's running CMS, that we are going to continue the work to advocate to have the agency really cover what's needed to reduce barriers to treatment and work for the American people. Because this is really about, our constituents, this is about our mothers, our fathers, our sisters, and it's people. And for me, because it's my mom and I see it every day when I'm home or even when I'm here and I get a call about something happening with my mother, it's immediately the conversation is, there's other people like her. And of course we know it's millions of people. And so Alzheimer's, you do hear more and more stories on the Hill of, my family member had this, or, my mother or my grandmother had it. That I think helps when there's that personal experience. I just wish we didn't all have to have as much personal experience if we just invested in it and got ahead of it. So I'm going to work with anybody, and my hope is in the Republican-led Congress or administration, we're going to continue that work.
Yeah, I guess I'd go there. So just more broadly, obviously we have a Republican full control coming in. Are you worried? Do you feel like there still will be bipartisan opportunities in this space or healthcare more broadly? Or, do you get the sense maybe they're going to try some more partisan? Obviously, in Trump's first term, it was Obamacare repeal out of the gate. Are you worried something more like that might happen again?
Well, I think we're always concerned about what's going to come when there's uncertainty. And, when you look at some of the picks, there's even greater uncertainty because you don't have folks that have been there who have had a lot of experience in the area. But, you don't know. And I have to keep positive, and that's how you get through the day on saying, who can we work with? And my hope, too, is that my Republican colleagues will continue that pressure on their leadership to say this is needed, and we have bipartisan support, which hopefully would make it easier to do, but I think it's holding the administration accountable, holding the Congress, whoever's in the majority and the minority accountable to constituents and to people. So I have to remain hopeful, and I think the biggest concern I have is there's always talks about cuts, and this seems to be the theme. Is cuts, cuts, cuts. And so I want to make sure that we're not cutting R&D and investment in Alzheimer's advancements. I want to make sure that we're not cutting, investments in the NIH or in other agencies where sometimes you hear the talking point and it's just like, we're going to dismantle this and that and we're going to replace everybody. And I think that's a more troubling conversation, but we'll have to just wait and see what happens and judge people on the actions. And hopefully there is a greater investment in healthcare, expanding healthcare, not narrowing it. We've definitely, it's a concern.
And we're getting towards the end, but maybe to end with just a broad question of, is there a common misconception about Alzheimer's you think that people who maybe don't have personal experience with it have, or something that comes up a lot that you feel like maybe you need to correct a little bit?
Well, I think one of the funniest things is when I get a new caregiver come in, how even though my mother is now nonverbal and she doesn't talk, the person will really raise their voice at her like she can't hear. And I say, oh, she can hear everything you're saying. If you whisper in the corner, her hearing is very good. And so I think sometimes when you don't know, there's somewhat of a misconception of, and then you hear the stories of if they're zoned out, that they don't really understand what's going on. And I do think that she does and that Alzheimer's patients do. I think it's just that they've lost their ability to communicate. And so, it's just treating people, I tell them, don't treat her like a baby, treat her like an adult that she is, and continue to respect her and give her the dignity. So it's a really challenging disease, if you know of anybody who's had it. how hard it is. What has been fascinating to me is finding the thing that still connects with her. And for her, that's music. And it's, Spanish is her native language. She knows English, but Spanish is her native language. And if I put the old Spanish records, music CDs for her, it's as close to getting her back. And she can't really sing along anymore, even though she tries. So it's finding that connection with your loved one that may, give them that sense of, I think, comfort and connection that I think is really important. So
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
continue to be patient and loving and caring with our love with Alzheimer's, and I'm a firm believer that keeping them in their home and their surroundings extends life and extends quality of life. So that's why I've done everything in my power to keep her at home. It was the one thing she had asked for before that she couldn't communicate anymore was, I want to die in my home. I want to be in my home, and I think that's really helpful. So those familiar surroundings, I think, are good for her.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for this
you.
great conversation.
Appreciate you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Welcoming back to the stage, Caitlin Owens.
All right, for our final guest today, we have a leading voice from the NIH. Please welcome the director of the NIH's Brain Initiative, Dr. John Nye. Dr. Nye, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here.
Let's start with an overview of what it is that you do. What is the Brain Initiative, and how is it different from the rest of what the NIH does?
Yeah, great question. So I have the privilege of overseeing what we call the Brain Initiative. BRAIN stands for Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. It was launched 10 years ago, so we're celebrating our 10th year in great existence. And the reason behind this Brain Initiative is as follows. Your brains, our brains, are the most complex organ in the body. They're arguably the most powerful, flexible, and energy-efficient computer known to humankind. And it gives rise to everything that makes us human, everything that makes us unique as humans, but also uniquely individuals from each other. And it carries this out because of its vast complexity. There are 86 billion, with a B, neurons between your ears, twice as many what we call non-neuronal cells, and they make hundreds of trillions of connections with each other. A fascinating piece of biology, but this complexity makes it also quite vulnerable to disease. Now, we don't yet have the tools to fully understand how this marvelous computer works. The rub is 1 in 3 Americans, over 100 million humans, are living with some disorder of the brain. So think about it. Everybody in this room, you and I, we either are living with some condition that affects our nervous system, or we have a loved one or a close friend who's also affected. And for those families, for our families, cures cannot come soon enough. And the goal of the Brain Initiative is to develop new technologies to understand how this incredible machine works, so we can figure out what goes wrong in disease and actually find cures, not just treatments, but cures.
And so how has the Brain Initiative changed research into Alzheimer's specifically within the NIH?
So can I give a little background?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's this amazing biological computer. So Caitlin, if I were to say, my cell phone, it's not giving me the right sound even though I give the right input. It's a computer. And I said, can you fix it for me? And I think the first thing one would do you'd want to get a parts list. What are all the components? What are all the pieces? What are the properties? How are they wired together? So you need a wiring diagram for them. And then very importantly, you need a source code. How is the information going from component to component through these wires to make these circuits? So your brain is composed of thousands and thousands, if not millions of circuits. So the goal of the Brain Initiative is to create these tools to understand how this 86 billion component computer works. And we're literally doing that right now. So for example, we have stood up a large project over the last 10 years that's cataloged every single cell type in the mouse brain, and we have a draft atlas of all the cell types in human brains. So that's a parts list. There's probably at least 5,000 cell types in the mouse brain that we've identified molecularly. We know their properties. 3,000 and counting in the human brain. So that's a part of this. You need a wiring diagram. We're standing up the technologies to give a full wiring diagram of the mouse and human brains. And then we're also developing tools to develop the source code. So how does that impact our study of Alzheimer's disease? So you may be aware of, you also heard earlier this morning, about the first disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's, these amazing monoclonal antibodies that are given to patients who are starting to show signs of cognitive decline. So they're already in kind of going down this cascade. But these are just treatments. They slow the progression, they don't stop it. And the effects, admittedly, are modest. And what we need to get at the earlier events. So using these incredible tools that we developed in the Brain Initiative to catalog all these cell types in the brain. And I should mention that the technologies we use over the last 10 years have gotten over between 50 and 100-fold more efficient. Wow. So forget Moore's Law. We've broken Moore's Law a long time ago, okay? And what this has allowed us to do is stand up the technologies to support a project called the Seattle Alzheimer's Disease Project. It's funded by the National Institute on Aging, but it's based on Brain Initiative technology, led by folks at the Allen Institute and the University of Washington. And what they did is they studied a large cohort of patients at different stages of the disease. And they looked at not just the end stage where you have plaques, you have tangles, but across the entire spectrum from early to late. And what they found by looking at the cells that are affected in the disease, they found two phases that wasn't appreciated before. An early, quiescent, kind of slow phase. Patients had moderate, if any, symptoms. And then a second half where you see this inexorable progression to severe dementia. Okay. So we heard earlier this focus on inflammation. That's certainly, they picked up, certainly the cells that are involved in inflammation or other changes. But unexpectedly, they found a particular cell type that was lost very early in the game, before there were really any symptoms. Now, this is one cell type out of maybe 3,000 or 5,000. This is how good our techniques are. And when that gives us, it gives us a target. So now we have cells, we know they're lost. We think that if you lose these cells, they're going to kind of matter. And we know what those cells are expressing in terms of genes, receptors, proteins, and now we have something we can pinpoint to target. So this is our contribution to accelerating discovery toward cures, not just treatments.
Yeah, so just connect the dots. Why does it matter to have that early stage target when it comes to actually coming up with some kind of treatment?
Right, so right now we have treatments that are disease modifying, but they come late in the game.
Right.
And I think we can all see that the damage has already been done. A lot of focus has been on these amyloid plaques, definitely playing a role. There's a new appreciation for tau tangles, definitely play a role. But what if we can get at the early events before all this damage happens, maybe in that early quiet phase? Then we have a chance of prevention, right? Or maybe even a cure. So our basic tenet is you can't fix what you don't understand, right? So if we know the parts, if we know why they're going wrong, and if we have a way of intervening in them, we have a chance of stopping this thing in its tracks. And that's the goal. I can't tell you when it's going to happen, but it's really giving us mechanistic insight into how we might approach this problem in a different way. It's going to take more than one approach to solve this public health crisis in Alzheimer's and the related dementias and other neurodegenerative disorders.
So your work obviously extends beyond Alzheimer's.
Yes.
There's a few treatment modes out there that I'll just say sound unreal almost these days. So a couple things that I know the Brain Initiative has been involved in is brain stimulation,
right,
and then brain-computer interfaces.
Right.
Can you tell us about some of the advancements and
what
we're learning about in those areas?
Love to. So the work I've been talking about so far is what we call basic fundamental research. Our goal is to provide the tools and resources, the knowledge that we need to push the field forward in translation and ultimately into clinical care. But we're helping people now, which is really cool. So, I mentioned we need a part system, we need a wiring diagram. We need to be able to understand what's going on in the circuits in your brain. Now, many of the disorders of the central nervous system, neurologic conditions, neuropsychiatric conditions, they are problems of circuits. The wiring, something happened with the wiring. They're not necessarily visible to us. We can't pinpoint a gene on it, but we can pinpoint activity on these circuits. So I think most of you have probably heard about deep brain stimulation. It's been around for decades now to treat folks with Parkinson's disease. It helps control their motor symptoms, tremors and what have you. And so that's been around for quite a while. About 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, people had this idea that, well, maybe we can extend this to more complex disorders, neuropsychiatric disorders. For example, severe depression, which can and does lead to suicide. Severe obsessive compulsive disorder, which is really truly debilitating. Post-traumatic stress disorder, binge eating disorder, substance use disorder, huge public health crisis for us. And on the flip side of that is chronic pain. So what can we learn about these brain circuits that are underlying these disorders? And can we literally help stimulate people back into a better state, right?
Right.
So the cool thing is, with better tools of mapping these circuits, with better ways of recording literally brain activity from patients, and then being able to take this jumble of activity. I've looked at these traces. You look, it's like a mess, right? But with advanced AI algorithms, researchers are able to make sense of this mess, and they're able to correlate certain patterns with different mood states, okay? And then we can go in and we can literally stimulate patients into a better state. I've talked to some of these patients. It's amazing. When they couldn't even get out of bed, when they just couldn't think about going on living, going through these therapies, they have their life back. They have their families back. And they're contributing to society and to their own sense of worth. And this was science fiction 10 years ago, and it's being applied to as these conditions: severe depression, OCD, PTSD, binge eating disorder, substance use disorder. We now have what we call these brainwave biomarkers for chronic pain, and early studies are showing that when we can stimulate these patients back into a better state. So the sky's the limit right now, and we're just really excited to see this happening. Again, what was science fiction 10 years ago is reality today, and we're looking forward to doing that in the next 10 years.
A little more science fiction, the brain-computer interfaces.
Yes, yes.
What's kind of the most exciting thing happening in that area?
Yeah, so there's great stuff going on related to the deep brain stimulation studies that I just told you about that are relying on being able to read out this brainwave activity and turn it into something useful, actionable. So you probably have seen, or you might even know somebody who's been either had a spinal cord injury, stroke, living with ALS. They're paralyzed. They can't, some of these individuals, they can't communicate, they can't talk. They're cognitively fine, but they're unable to communicate. And this is what we call so-called locked-in syndrome, which is really devastating. And so we funded a number of researchers who have been able to figure out what are the brainwave activities that drive, for example, speech, or the ability to imagine numbers or letters, and to decode that information to drive what we call a brain-computer interface neural prosthesis. So you've heard about prosthetic devices. This is one that actually takes brain activity and drives it into either text or speech. And this has been going on. It's amazing stuff. We had a recent example from a group at University of California, Davis, funded by actually one of our institutes, the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, but based on technology that Brain has been building over the last 10 years. And they have a patient, a human research participant. He's in his 40s. He has ALS. He's locked in. He's what we call anarthic. He can't talk, but he can try to enunciate the words and letters. And they placed 4 electrodes on the part of his brain, the motor cortex that drives speech, and they had that drive an artificial neural network, a very fancy AI algorithm. They still haven't told me exactly what the magic sauce was, but and then they had it drive a speech synthesizer. Now the cool thing is, there's 2 cool things. One is that this gentleman is a climate activist. He's very active. He's done a lot of video shows and what have you. They took his videos and they were able to have this drive not just a speech synthesizer like you might have heard through watching films of Stephen Hawking, but it's in his own voice. So that was one big thing. The other big thing was they were able to tune this artificial neural network so it's literally plug and play. Within an hour and a half of training, he could literally converse with you.
Wow.
And I've seen the clips of this. You have to have a box of tissue next to you. It's just so moving. It's life-changing. For the time he has left with us, he's able to live a full life. He's able to talk to his daughter. He's able to actually have Zoom calls with his colleagues and continue driving the passion that he has as a human while he's with us.
That sounds amazing. Unfortunately, we can't hear any more because we are out of time. We can't wait to learn more about what the Brain Initiative is doing in future years. It's so interesting and cutting edge. But Dr. Knight, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us this morning. And be sure to continue to follow our healthcare coverage at Axios.com and grab a coffee on your way out. Thanks.